Professor Boyce Davies, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about the late George Lamming. When you hear the name George Lamming, what comes to mind?
What comes to mind, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity, is the strength and presence of the Caribbean radical intellectual tradition. He was the first writer from the Caribbean that I encountered during my years as a graduate student studying African literature at Howard University through a professor named Wilfred Carty, who had written the famous book called Whispers from a Continent. And he invited George Lamming to campus. Now, keep in mind, Howard University is that place that almost everybody of note that you would want to meet from the Black world would somehow show up on campus. So George Lamming, for me, was the first. And that presence, his appearance, his hair, his confidence, his love for Black culture, Caribbean culture, and its links with African culture, all of that comes through when you meet him in that shocking afro, which as he got older became white, white-haired, and even more elegant. But he's the first. And I say this because I was on a campus where one would, as I said, would meet many different people. And CLR James, the famous, taught a graduate course on Pan-Africanism, which friends of mine would take, and I would go and sit in the James class. And actually, the next person I would meet and hear from would be now the famous Sylvia Winter, who came to CLR James's class to give a lecture. So I just am so blessed by having had these exposures at a formative time in my career, whereby those examples were so stellar and so confident and so proud and so supportive of the next generation of scholars to which I belong. And therefore he is that person, if I can wrap it up like that. But then beyond that, the more, as you know, the more you grow and the more you study these writers, the more you learn. So his breadth would extend way beyond, of course, that first encounter with him and the novel In the Castle of My Skin, to all of his various works, all of his other contributions, and of course his political linkages, and the way that he engaged every single one of the Caribbean radical activists and intellectuals, from Walter Rodney to Maurice Bishop. His work in Cuba, where I just came from, was just amazing. So for me, Lamming is a giant. He's a griot, he's an intellectual writer, creative intellectual that is part of a generation that we are losing, sadly, but they've contributed so immensely that we just have to approximate or do the best that we can to meet their expectations and what they set out as their guidelines for how we can move in the world.
What would you consider to be the importance of his writing? How transformative was the work by George Lamming?
Well, first of all, In the Castle of My Skin, an autobiographical novel, was the first time that we saw in writing, for me as a Black feminist scholar, the presence of the Caribbean woman and how she raised the child by herself in this particular case, but with, of course, extended community and family context in many ways that replicated some of our own experiences as Caribbean people growing up, the ways in which women have had to sometimes shoulder the burden of raising these children. The so-called mother who fathered me figure is clearly one that is represented there. But beyond that, the colonial childhood and how somebody like Lamming grew up in that childhood, its punitive ways of educating with a lot of physical abuse and corporal punishment, and all that means, and what the young boys in that context had to experience in order to become men. So Lamming sort of, as part of that generation that grew up in the Caribbean under colonialism and then went to England to further their careers and then became writers and became that formative generation. You have then him expanding and then reflecting on what it is to be West Indian, first of all, so-called, and then what it is to be a Caribbean intellectual, what it is to be a writer. And he's so definitive about that. So for me, that's the import of Lamming, that ability to see the Caribbean in its strength and its breadth, but in its linkages to not just the so-called mother countries, but to the other places in the world where Black subjectivity is also powerfully strong. And I love that. So one of the things I learned, for example, is that he was one of the writers attending that important Congress of Black Writers in Paris in 1956. And there he met everybody. Senghor, I mean, you know, Sheikh Anta Diop, I mean, he met Richard Wright there. I mean, there are photographs, that amazing photograph of all of them. So he was part of that group. And we're so lucky that he lived till 94 so that we could still have his presence and engage him and talk with him and really see him as for what he it was and is to the Caribbean at large.
Some of the people I have talked to in preparation for this interview, something that kept on coming up is how good a conversationist he was. How did that come out when you listened to him, you know, as a student at Howard? And I don't know whether you met him later, but tell me about him when you met him in Blood and Fresh.
Right. Well, he, first of all, that Howard meeting was, I have to say, was one in which I was a timid grad student who probably stayed on in awe of meeting somebody as big as that. So did not have conversation at all, would not have had the opportunity to do that, but just admired him from a distance, as you did almost all of those other figures. But I would subsequently invite him to speak at my university when I taught at State University of New York, Binghamton, and he came and spoke to my class and gave a presentation. And, you know, we did the normal things with dinner where you take the writer out. And then he came to my house and listened to Calypso music that I was playing for him and met my children. So he was then a much more, you know, at home kind of person at that time, able to relax and enjoy the company of everybody. And I was actually asking my daughters recently if they remembered him. One did, and the other one was too little, so she didn't remember. But then the more significant encounter with him was that I had to interview him for my book on Claudia Jones, the book called Left of Karl Marx, because he was a good friend of Claudia Jones in London. In fact, he was one of the pallbearers at her funeral. She died in 1964. So he was the one actually who I went to meet in Barbados in his residence then at the Atlantis Hotel. And there he really gave me a nice friendly encounter so we could talk about her. He showed me the Atlantic Ocean, which from the Atlantis Hotel one could see. And it seems he spent a lot of time walking the beach there. And he always reflected to me that when he stood at the Atlantis Hotel and looked out at the Atlantic, he thought of the journeys of the slave ships, and he could imagine them being out there, because that, keep in mind, Barbados was one of the first places too that some of those ships docked, and Barbados became like the first British slave plantation colony, right? So he always saw the Atlantic in its beauty, but in its strength and all its difficulties and what that means. And he had a vantage point from that Atlantis Hotel. So that's the kind of thing he shared with me. And then also about Claudia Jones, he talked about her as an activist, as a radical intellectual, but the kind of person who encouraged him to participate. So he said sometimes, you know, she would come by and invite him to go to something that she was organizing. And when he got there, it would be like a rally or some sort of major event, political event that she grabbed him and went to. And he was the one actually, because people always ask me, how come there's not a significant encounter between Claudia Jones and CLR James? And he explained that to me. He said they moved in totally different directions, that James was much more the sort of intellectual Marxist, and Claudia was the street kind of activist. So they were moving in two different directions, or two different groups of people. So there was not a lot of encountering with them between the two of them, although there's one discussion of them being on the same panel for the benefit of a hurricane that happened in the Caribbean. So he gave me like the personal firsthand view of Claudia Jones. And my book is stronger because of him infusing that sense of who she was into my own ability to write about her. And then he wrote the blurb at the back of the book, which is like really, I mean, to have George Lamming write a blurb for you for your book is like, bingo, you know, you won already. You need nothing else. So those are the ways in which I remember him as a conversationalist and as a person who was so charming. Oh, and the other thing was I was at Brown University talking about Claudia Jones while he was a professor there. He would visit for 5 years. He and Amataidu would visit for 5 years, each in the spring semester or the fall, one of the two. And he came to my talk, and again, because I was giving a lecture about Claudia Jones, I was like quite taken by the fact that Lamming was in the audience, sitting all the way in the back in the corner, checking it out. I was, you you had to really represent when you have that kind of presence in the room. So I feel honored. I'm part of a generation that is totally informed and influenced by those guys and those women who preceded us with such strength, such courage, and such clarity about their politics. Or the other related point, there was a conference in Walter Rodney in Binghamton again a few years later, and George Lamming was an invited guest, as was Sylvia Wynter. Sylvia Wynter was giving a lecture, and quite a few of the Pan-Africanist scholars, some of them started challenging her about what she was saying and indicating that she seemed not to be clear about what she was arguing and so on. And Lamming defended her. He got up and said, no, he does not see her at all as being mired in her own discourse, which was a phrase one of them used. And in fact, he represented her as one of the thinkers of the Caribbean who was really going into and elucidating some really critical aspects of Black cultural presences in the New World. And now, of course, Wynter is one of the critical theorists that everybody turns to. So he was ahead of the curve in representing her at that time and defending her.
He belongs to that generation of intellectuals and thinkers and activists that were produced by the historical circumstances of that period. It seemed to be a period of new beginning. There was a lot of hope, but then historically, there was all these tragedies that their parents, their grandparents, their ancestors had gone through. Can you take me through that?
Well, first of all, and I was, as I indicated, I was just teaching in Havana, University of Havana, and the course that I did actually began along the lines of what you're talking about. Because one of the first things one has to do in terms of addressing any aspect of Caribbean literature is to begin with the sort of traumatic events, that created our presence in the Caribbean, right? So Jamaica Kincaid has an interesting phrase where she says that she realized with a shock when she was a child going through school that her presence on the island was the result of really a horrible history, a horrible deed that had happened, and that still continued. So the presence of Afro-Caribbean people and Afro-Indians and Indo-Caribbeans as well, in these beautiful islands had to do with the creation of plantation slavery and the need for labor to work those plantation slavery and the ongoing oppression that lasted 300 years or so in terms of that whole process. So how to recover from all of that is still an ongoing issue. And of course, it was not just slavery, but then it was followed by colonialism, in which you had now the dominance of these colonial powers, the British, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and so on in the Caribbean, each with a portion of the Caribbean, creating these divisions then that we still live with. So Lamming is really clear about reconstituting that Caribbean identity, the sort of one Caribbean that people hope for, where the activists in London in particular, particularly the ones I interviewed, felt that the Caribbean would not be able to become its full self until it had some sort of a unified presentation beyond the island separations, which is difficult already, but also beyond the linguistic separation. So Lamming, I think, is one of those people who sought to break through all of that and find a way to really encounter the full Caribbean. And I think I read something which said that he actually visited and spoke at almost every one of the Caribbean islands and was very frequently a presence in places like Havana, Cuba. In fact, he was identified at Casa de las Americas when I was there last week as one of the major friends of the Caribbean and friends of the Cuban Revolution, which is really a significant compliment to receive. So he is that person then who really had faith that the Caribbean, as it sought to recover from those traumatic experiences, still had the beauty and the culture and the possibility of making those leaps into the future, which would take us where we need to be, and worked assiduously to achieve that. So, I mean, we are beneficiaries, as I keep saying, of that amount of work and that commitment to seeing us grow.
If you were to walk into your bookshelf, which book would you pick by George Lamming?
Oh, wow, that's a wonderful question. I think I would, I need to go back and read all of them, because now, as you know, once you've lost the writer, you're like, those are the things you have that you're left with. I need to go back to The Pleasures of Exile. I've used portions of it in teaching, and I'm thinking I'm going to use it in the fall when I teach Caribbean Worlds at Cornell. Have students read The Pleasures of Exile. And for me, as you know, the good profs, and I'm one of them, we like to make sure that whatever the students are reading, that we are also rereading as well, so that we really up to date on those arguments and what he contributes. So I'm going to go back to The Pleasures of Exile. But he has such a breadth of materials, and we are fortunate that we have videos of him talking about some of his work. So we are fortunate that the generation that follows can actually look back and see who these people were. So when I teach Caribbean Worlds, it's actually an introductory course. And I've taught Caribbean literature from time to time, but you tend to look at a lot of the contemporary writers. And you use Lamming and the others in terms of having them read selections, but this is a good time to go back now and read have them read a full text by him and share with him so that they meet him again in a more developed way. But one of my colleagues, younger colleagues from UWI, University of the West Indies, Aaron Kamugisha, and I complimented him on doing this. He created the whole Lamming syllabus. And he's somebody you might want to talk to, because he did the Lamming syllabus for Lamming's 90th birthday or something like that. So it would have been like 4 years ago. And the syllabus actually was meant to cover all of Lamming's work and have the students read all of it. And that's a really major thing for students at the University of the West Indies, as you can imagine. They needed to do that. And I'm happy as well that the Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Hilary Beckles, created a structure for Lamming to just be a faculty in residence, a writer in residence towards the end of his life, so that people could meet him and he could just be there and do some of the editorial work in bringing back some of the old magazines. So that was really a nice thing that happened as well. So he will get a lot of honors in the Caribbean. You better believe it.
One thing for me that happens when a writer dies is to go back and now realize that we can go back and look at their work differently, because it becomes clear where the work started and where the work ended. So when you look at this body of work by George Lamming, now that he is no longer with us, and you can reflect on that body of work and his contribution, what do you think?
I think he, well, first of all, was part of that generation, as I indicated, that created Caribbean literature. So when you think of Caribbean literature, you have to think of Lamming. Up until then, a few people were writing. C.L.R. James had written a novel. Mintiali and so on, but you don't have a body of material. Ironically, it's when they go to London that you have this generation that comes together and define who they are as Caribbean people, as Caribbean subjects in their relationship to colonialism. And then they're able to define that body of literature called Caribbean literature today. So see him then as one of the definers of what is Caribbean literature, in much the same way as Amy Césaire is for Francophone Caribbean literature. Lamming is that person as well. And interestingly, they would also have met at that Congress of Black Writers in Paris. You met Fernande as well in 1956. So we're talking watershed, we're talking landmark, we're talking people who define the whole body of materials, the whole fields. So every one of his works then have to be reaccounted for and then placed in context, particularly the fact that he took to task as well the Shakespearean Tempest and the construction of Caliban as the Caribbean subject, the Caribbean male subject, and what that meant to recreating Caribbean literature. Because remember, Caliban had said in the Tempest, you taught me language, but the benefit of it is that I learned how to curse you, right? So technically he became part of that generation that was able then to go back and technically use that discourse of talking back to empire, speaking back to the colonial definers in ways that would they can understand and ways that challenge them for what they understood. So any understanding of colonialism and literature, any understanding of how we constructed the subjects, any understanding of our relationship to the rest of the world, and of course our definitions of ourselves as part of the African diaspora would have to go towards people like Lamming and their definitions of the Caribbean. So to me, that's the strength of Lamming right there.
If you are to look at his contribution globally, what would be your analysis?
Well, interestingly, what he did, and that's what we like about Lamming, his bravery. When Walter Rodney died, he went and spoke at his funeral. And that was considered quite a daring thing to do, because at the time, Rodney, of course, was assassinated by the state, by the Guyanese state. So here's Lamming speaking powerfully at that funeral, and really showing that he was not afraid to challenge the ways in which the state had sort of cannibalized the youth, if you will. Of course, here was Walter Rodney, very young, very smart historian, very powerful, and then he is assassinated by the state. So that's that bravery as well. And the story you mentioned about him meeting Maurice Bishop and being there with him was always significant. So keep in mind that those people who were doing the kind of Caribbean transformative politics, Rodney, Bishop, and so on, from the Caribbean left, were hoping to recreate, let's say, new societies where we were able to live our fullest sense of who we are. And I think Lamming saw that in Havana, in Cuba, with his conversations with Fidel as well. He met Fidel and was able to talk with him. And I was reading somewhere that when he came to Trinidad as a young man and worked there, he taught in a school where he was able to learn Spanish from the Venezuelan community. So as a result, he had a fluency in Spanish, which he could use in different contexts. So he was the full Caribbean man, full Caribbean person, but a full Black man in his presence, in his sense of self and confidence. So for me, if you want to think of him in this larger sense, it would have to be the larger Caribbean sense, but also the larger global literary sense, and also the larger African diasporic sense, which I'm seeing as the umbrella for all of those ways in which we understand him.
What do you think is going to be his legacy?
His legacy, those amazing novels, those novels that he created will be read and reread. He will be seen as foundational to Caribbean literature, and he will be seen as one of the foremost creative intellectual subjects that we had with us for 94 years. That is phenomenal, you know. And I said at his memorial at Casa de las Americas in Havana, that although he died maybe 4 or 5 days short of his 95th birthday, technically he lived 95 years. I mean, you can't can fudge a few days, right? Um, but keep in mind that he lived almost a century. So that ability to have, the people who do that long distance run, and really take it all the way out to the end, from the beginnings in the 1920s all the way to 2022, that is phenomenal. So that long-lived experience, which spans the breadth of the colonial experience, through independence, through republic status, through all of the changes we had from Black Power to everything. He saw all of those movements as they unfolded up until the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So look at the breadth of that experience. So that's, to me, what he was fortunate to have lived that long, and we were fortunate to have had him with us through that century, that amazing 20th century, and into the 21st. Who knows how it's going to work out for us, given all of the complications we have with environment and gun violence and everything. But he gives us example of how we can be proud, how we can be confident, how we can be who we are, and not feel any less in encountering dominance or repressive cultures and so on. So that's Lamming. And I'm happy Barbados is honoring him. Hilary Beckles and Mia Motley, that she is going to be the leader that takes Barbados into Republican status, and Lamming saw that. So just imagine that he was able to know that that happened in his lifetime. We're happy to have had him with us that long.
If you were to write his biography, what are some of the things that you would highlight about him?
I would highlight that really handsome white hair. Because when you saw him in a room, that was the first thing you saw, that shocking white hair and how beautiful it was. And that he kept it for so long and did not flinch at all from representing himself with that. But also his humility. He was always somebody who, when you saw him in a room, he was not like pompously running around saying, I'm a writer, I'm a writer. He was just himself, pleasant. And also mentor, because writers like Edwidge Santicat, who worked with him when he taught at the University of Miami's Caribbean Literature School, said that Lamming taught her pace, how to slow down the work and let it unfold. She said she would write quickly, whatever it was that she was writing. And he was like, no, you have to slow down and really savor it and let the work unfold. So that mentoring of new writers and really helping them become who they should be is also something that I would say be one I really also give him credit for doing. And as I said, emulating him is the best we can do in terms of how we live.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with me about George Lamming that I have not asked you?
Yeah, well, at Casa de las Americas, he was really foundational there as well. He was one of the judges of the early prizes of Casa de las Americas, but also of the new Caribbean Literary Prize, the Bocas Prize that was created in Trinidad as well, was one of the first judges of that. So again, helping the next generation of writers go forward. But in Casa de las Americas, they talked about him consistently as always coming to Cuba, even at times when many people were not going out of their way to come to Cuba. He was there. They saw him as a loyal participant, loyal friend, presence, and really honored and recognized him for all of those ways in which he shared his love for the Cuban people and the Cuban Revolution. And that is quite significant. And that's what I want to say for Lamming, especially just having come from Havana, how proud they were of knowing him and how respectful they were of his history and honoring him.
I don't know how to thank you, Prof.
Not at all. It's my pleasure. It's an honor, and I thank you for asking me.